This is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life events. In the late autumn of 1891, Clara Thorne, a widow who felt nearly as transparent as the mist rising from the river, stood before the looming glass conservatory on the outskirts of Blackwood Valley. It was a structure that the local villagers spoke of, in hushed, fearful tones, as if the very glass held secrets that could shatter if looked at too closely. She was the first person in a very long time to look at the withered blossoms inside, as if they still possessed some inherent value, unaware that as the silent master of the house observed her from the shadows, others were already drafting the documents intended to cast her out into the cold. The wind swept through the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, tugging at Clara's dark skirts as she clutched a basket of dried lavender and rosemary. She had not yet reached her 30th year, but she walked with the heavy, measured step of someone who had carried the weight of a century on her shoulders. Her hands, which had once been soft and nimble when she was a young girl, had grown rough and calloused from a constant cycle of tying bouquets, boiling roots to dye old ribbons, and gathering the wild flora that the rest of the world had discarded. The town of Blackwood Valley was a place where silence was rarely respectful and almost always observational. As Clara crossed the central square, the local women would lift their heads briefly, their whispers trailing behind her, like the dust on her hem. It wasn't that they were overtly cruel, but in small, isolated towns, someone else's grief is often treated as a public commodity, something to be analyzed and weighed until it loses its personal sting. Clara had become the widow Thorne before she had truly learned how to be a wife, losing her husband Arthur to a sudden devastating fever that had taken him in less than 6 days. He had left her with a name she felt she was merely borrowing, 2 unresolved debts she didn't fully understand, and a small, weathered cottage by the old creek where the dampness crept through the wooden floorboards and made the walls groan in the middle of the night. The worst part of her loss had not been the funeral or the cold silence of the first evening alone, but the arrival of her brother-in-law, Julian. He was a man of grave voice and practiced gestures of correctness, who came to her claiming that by law and by blood he was the only one fit to manage what little remained of Arthur's estate. Julian's presence always felt like a shadow stretching across her kitchen table, smelling faintly of expensive tobacco and a cold, calculating ambition. He never insulted her directly. Julian was not a man of vulgar outbursts. He was far more dangerous because he always seemed to have the law on his side, even if that law was merely the consensus of the powerful men who sat in the village tavern. Every visit from him brought a new form of pressure, a paper she couldn't decipher, a debt he claimed Arthur had hidden, or a stern warning about how difficult it would be for a solitary woman to maintain a property in such a harsh climate. To survive, Clara sold her dried flowers in the morning, mended heavy coats for the mill workers in the afternoon, and locked her door with a heavy iron bolt at night, as if wood and metal could protect her from the growing fear that her life was becoming a shrinking cage. She often touched the thin copper ring on her finger, wondering when the world had become so narrow and why the absence of the children she had never been able to conceive was now used by the town as a silent accusation of her incompleteness. On that particular market morning, as she arranged her modest bundles of dried herbs on a faded linen cloth, she overheard 2 young girls whispering behind the village fountain. They spoke of how her house was no longer hers, and how Julian intended to claim the entire parcel before the first heavy snows of December arrived. Clara did not lift her head, focusing instead on the precision of her work, but something inside her chest hardened into a knot of silent resistance. She had sold very little that day, only 3 bundles of lavender, 2 bags of rosemary, and a handful of straw flowers to Mrs. Higgins the baker, who crossed herself before paying as if a widow's flowers carried a trace of misfortune. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Clara decided to take the long path home. She avoided the main thoroughfare, preferring the northern trail where the red clay was thick and the traffic was sparse. It was there that she saw him again, the man the village called Silas the Outcast. The conservatory rose behind a dark wooden fence, its long glass panes shimmering like still water in the fading light. Silas Vance had bought the property years ago, and since then he had become the subject of endless, dark speculation. Some said he was a disgraced soldier. Others claimed he was the son of a high-born family who had fled a scandal. But everyone agreed he was a man of impossible character and deep scars. Through the steam and the green shadows of the glass, Clara saw a tall figure with broad shoulders leaning over a cultivation table. There was no wildness in the scene, only a startling, quiet delicacy. He moved his fingers across the leaves of a pale sprout as if he were touching something incredibly fragile, surrounded by plants that Clara could not name, flowers with long, elegant stems and vines held in place by clean white cords. She would have hurried past if her shoe hadn't crunched against a piece of loose gravel, causing the man to lift his head instantly. His eyes were as dark and unblinking as she had heard, but the quality that reached her across the distance was not hardness. It was a vigilant, weary exhaustion, the look of someone who had spent too much time waiting for a blow to fall. Silas stepped out of the conservatory without haste, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by veins and an old, jagged scar near the wrist. He did not smile, nor did he attempt to intimidate her. He simply watched her with a stillness that was more disarming than any sudden movement. "It is going to get dark soon," he said, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of a man who spoke only when necessary. "That path becomes nothing but mud a few kilometers ahead." Clara tightened her grip on her basket, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I know the way," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded slightly, his gaze dropping for a moment to the contents of her basket. "Dried flowers," he noted, though it wasn't a question. "It is what I sell," she answered. A brief silence fell between them, filled only by the wind rattling the dry stalks of the poplars behind the fence. "The lavender is well preserved," Silas said, speaking as if the quality of her work actually mattered to the world. Clara didn't know how to respond. It had been months since anyone had looked at her efforts with anything other than pity or dismissal. The simple observation, offered without condescension, felt like a strange, almost painful intrusion. "Good evening," she murmured, taking a step to continue her journey, but he spoke again before she could vanish into the shadows. "If you pass this way tomorrow, I will buy a bouquet from you." Clara turned back, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Why would a man with a whole glass house of living plants want dried flowers? A shadow of a memory seemed to cross his face, though it stopped short of a smile. "Flowers that survive after being cut usually last longer than most people," he replied. Clara did not fully understand the answer, but she found she could not forget it as she hurried home through the gathering gloom. That night, Clara did not sleep well. The wind battered the wooden siding of her cottage with a hollow insistence that felt less like weather and more like a collection of ghosts. She lit her lamp twice, checked the bolt on the door 3 times, and yet she could not shake the image of the conservatory from her mind. The misted glass, the scent of damp earth, and the silhouette of the man leaning over his plants remained burned into her vision like a quiet ember. She scolded herself for being so easily unsettled by a stranger, especially one with such a dark reputation. In a place like Blackwood Valley, a misinterpreted glance was enough to fuel a week of malicious gossip, and she was already standing on a precipice. Yet her mind kept returning to his words about the flowers. There was a hidden pain in them, not a pain displayed to garner sympathy, but one that had been dried and worked from the inside until it became a habit. Clara knew that kind of sorrow. It was the kind that didn't make you cry in public, but settled in your chest and learned how to breathe alongside you. At dawn, she rose with tired eyes and cold hands, She boiled water for a thin tea, mended a frayed ribbon on her bonnet, and prepared the bundles she would take to the square. As she tied the lavender with rough hemp twine, a firm, rhythmic knock sounded at her door. Her entire body tensed, thinking for a terrifying second that Julian had returned earlier than promised. But the knock was too steady, too respectful. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Higgins, the baker from the lower alley. She was a woman of wide hips and red cheeks, whose voice usually rang out like a bell across the market, but today she looked troubled. "Clara, I've come early because the ovens will be full by 8 o'clock, she said without preamble. "Do you have any dried rosemary? My daughter-in-law woke with a tight chest, and I want to make her an infusion." Clara nodded and retrieved a prepackaged bag. Mrs. Higgins paid her in small copper coins, but she lingered at the threshold, her eyes darting toward the path leading to the village. "I saw your brother-in-law at the clerk's office this morning with Mr. Sterling," the baker whispered, her voice dropping to a low, urgent tone. Clara felt a chill settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I don't know anything for certain, but when a man like Julian starts looking for old ledgers, it is rarely for the benefit of anyone but himself." There was no need for further explanation. Clara understood the warning perfectly. She thanked the woman and closed the door slowly, leaning her forehead against the cool wood for a long moment. The weight of the threat felt heavier now, more concrete. She decided then that she would not take the northern path that morning. She told herself it was out of prudence, a need to reach the market early, but in truth, she was avoiding the conservatory because she didn't want to see if Silas would keep his word, or worse, if she truly wanted him to. The market was busier than the day before, filled with farmers bringing sacks of grain, young girls selling eggs, and 2 men from the highlands offering thick sheepskins. Clara spread her linen cloth in her usual corner near the lime-washed wall of the old chapel. The first few hours passed with agonizing slowness. She sold a bit of chamomile and a bag of dried petals to Miss Thorne, the retired schoolteacher, who was one of the few people who still addressed her by her Christian name rather than her misfortune. Around noon, when the sun beat straight down onto the cobblestones, a long shadow fell across her display. Clara looked up, her breath catching in her throat. It was Silas Vance. He was not wearing a hat, and the harsh midday light revealed the sharp lines of his face, the straight nose, the prominent cheekbones, and the severe, unmoving line of his mouth. He was dressed in a dark shirt and a plain vest, looking less like a man who had come to buy flowers and more like a man who had wandered into the wrong century. "I said I would come," he murmured, his voice cutting through the noise of the market like a sharpened blade. He pointed to a small bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon. "That one." Clara picked up the bouquet of lavender and rosemary, her fingers brushing against his as she handed it over. The contact was brief, a mere second of shared warmth, but something inside her contracted as if her body recognized a different kind of presence before her mind could catch up. Silas placed more coins on the cloth than the flowers were worth. "It is too much," Clara said immediately, trying to push the extra silver back toward him. "I am charging you for a bouquet, not the entire harvest." He looked at her for several seconds, his dark eyes devoid of hardness, but filled with a distance that demanded caution. "Then take the rest as payment for something else," he replied. "For what else?" she asked. "For telling me yesterday that those flowers were simply what you sell. Most would have tried to dress it up with a lie." Clara didn't know whether to feel insulted or strangely seen. She opted for the only thing that allowed her to maintain her composure. "I am not in the habit of lying to make a sale," she said. "I have already noticed that," Silas replied. Another silence followed, one of those moments where the air feels too thick to breathe. It was then that a familiar and unpleasant voice broke the spell. Well, well, so the rumors were true. Clara turned, her heart sinking. Julian was advancing through the stalls in his dark suit, his mustache neatly trimmed, and his expression one of polished, manufactured respectability. He came alone. but his presence was no less threatening for it. He stopped beside Clara's stall, looking first at Silas, then at the coins on the cloth, and finally at the bouquet in the tall man's hand. "I didn't realize widowhood was being worn with such haste these days," he said with a venomous sweetness. Clara stood up immediately, her hands trembling. "Don't start this, Julian." The man feigned a look of wounded surprise. "Start what? I am merely greeting my sister-in-law and her customer." The pause before the last word was deliberate, a calculated insult intended to stain her reputation in front of the entire square. Silas did not move a single muscle, but the quality of his stillness changed. It became denser, more alert. "Mr. Vance," Julian continued, tilting his head slightly, "I don't know what stories you've been told, but this woman is going through a very delicate situation. It would be prudent not to encourage any misunderstandings." Clara felt the humiliation burning in her throat like lye. "I am not a child, Julian," she snapped. "No, you are a widow alone," he corrected her coldly. "And widows alone need to guard their reputations, especially when they have pending property matters to discuss." The last words were a direct threat, a reminder that he held the power to take the roof from over her head. Clara opened her mouth to argue, but Silas spoke first. His voice was so low that it forced Julian to lean in to hear him. "If you have something to say to her, say it without using me as an excuse." There was no loud challenge, but the firmness in his tone was enough to make Julian's smile falter. "I didn't intend to offend you," Julian lied. "Then don't," Silas replied. A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd, not of open scandal, but of focused attention. Clara saw Mrs. Higgins pretending to adjust her bread baskets, and the butcher's boy standing frozen with a meat hook in his hand. Julian held Silas's gaze for a few more seconds before turning back to Clara. "This afternoon, I will be at your house with the papers. It would be best if you were there." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the stone. Clara remained standing, her body rigid and her hands like ice. The market began to move again, but for her, the air had turned stagnant. Silas placed the bouquet back down on the linen. "You shouldn't have to endure that alone," he said. Clara snapped her head toward him, her frustration bubbling over. "I have been enduring things alone for a very long time, Mr. Vance. I know how to do it." She regretted the sharpness of her tone almost instantly, but the pity of a stranger felt more painful than the cruelty of a relative. "I know," he said quietly. "I know how a town speaks when it thinks a person is unprotected. And I know how men use papers when they want to steal what doesn't belong to them." Clara looked down at her feet. The truth, when spoken by someone else, often weighed twice as much. "I don't need you to defend me," she whispered. "I didn't," he replied. "I only asked him to speak plainly." He picked up the flowers again. "If you are to receive papers this afternoon that you do not understand, do not sign them." Clara lifted her head. "And what am I supposed to do? Ask the village for advice? Ask the priest who told me to practice resignation? Ask a man I barely know?" Silas held her gaze without taking offense. "You are supposed to make time. Nothing more. Winning a single day is sometimes the same as winning the entire winter." The sentence hung between them like a bridge. Then, as if he had no right to stay a moment longer, Silas nodded and disappeared into the crowd, the dried bouquet clutched in his large hand. He didn't look back, but Clara watched him until he vanished past the blacksmith's alley. The rest of her day was interminable. She sold very little and thought too much. Every time she looked up, she felt as if someone were watching her, weighing her worth against Julian's ambition. She returned to her cottage before the sun had fully set. The sky was covered in a low, heavy gray, and the creek sounded colder than usual. She barely had time to set her basket down before she heard the sound of approaching wheels. Julian did not knock. He pushed the door open after a short, sharp bang and entered with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Behind him came the clerk from the village office, a thin man with yellowed fingers and eyes that avoided hers at all costs. "Good evening," Julian said, as if he were visiting a sick relative out of mere courtesy. "I hope we aren't interrupting." Clara stood by the table, her heart racing. "You've already entered. It would be useless to pretend to ask." Julian set the portfolio down and pulled out several thick sheets of parchment. "These are the documents to regularize the house and the plot. There are outstanding debts, back taxes, and a temporary administration agreement. Nothing serious, if you cooperate." "I want to read them," Clara said, her voice trembling but clear. Julian smiled with a practiced, weary patience. "Clara, you know these papers are full of legal jargon. It wouldn't do you any good to get tangled up in them. That is what the men of the family are for." She felt a surge of anger so clean and sharp that it gave her a momentary strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Arthur was my family," she said. Julian's expression hardened. "Arthur is dead." The silence that followed was bitter. The clerk looked at his shoes. "I will not sign today," Clara said. Julian blinked, surprised to find direct resistance where he expected a quick surrender. "What do you mean? You don't understand the urgency." "I understand it perfectly," she countered. "And I still will not sign today." Julian leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing. "Listen to me. If you don't settle this before December, you will have no house and no right to claim anything. I am trying to save you from a greater shame." Clara thought of the market, of Silas's voice telling her to make time. "Then save me tomorrow," she said. Julian looked at her as if he didn't recognize the woman standing before him. "Who has been filling your head with these ideas?" She didn't answer, but the man understood more than she said. It was him, wasn't it? The outcast. Clara held his gaze. "It was my decision." But Julian was no longer listening. A darker, uglier emotion appeared on his face. "Be careful, Clara. Men like that don't get close to a solitary woman for free." The insult stung, but she didn't lower her head. "And men like you never help for free either." Julian froze for a second, then gathered his papers with slow, ferocious movements. "I will return tomorrow," he said, tucking the sheets away. "And it would serve you well to remember that in this valley, a woman's stubbornness usually costs her dearly." When he left, the cottage felt as if it were filled with a tension so thick she had to sit down just to breathe. Her hands were shaking violently. She didn't know if she had just saved herself or placed herself in even greater danger. Outside, the sky finished darkening over the creek, and it was then, in the middle of that deep twilight, that she heard a soft rustle on the porch. It wasn't a knock or an intrusion. It was the sound of something being placed carefully against the wood. She waited a long time before she gathered the courage to open the door. A bouquet was leaning against the threshold, lavender and rosemary, the very same one she had sold in the market, but it was tied with a new, clean ribbon of dark blue. Clara knelt and picked it up. Among the dried herbs was a small, fresh branch of salvia that she hadn't put there. She recognized the scent immediately. It was earthy and medicinal, tazahi cut from a living plant. Something in her chest tightened. It wasn't a romantic gesture. There was no lightness of courtship in it. It was a different kind of care, a sober and quiet recognition of her struggle. She closed the door and placed the bouquet on the table, watching it under the low light of the lamp, as if she expected the flowers to speak. No answers came. Only the dry perfume of the lavender and the living scent of the salvia. That night, she slept poorly again, but the reason had changed. It was no longer just the fear of Julian. It was the disconcerting sensation that someone had seen her exhaustion and responded to it without asking for anything in return. Clara didn't know what to do with a kindness like that. Cruelty can be fought, and pity can be endured, but sincere respect disarms you. The following morning dawned with a sky covered in thick, leaden clouds that made the humble cottages of the valley look even poorer. There was moisture on the boards, and the air smelled of cold earth. Clara lit the stove, heated water, and tried to occupy herself with concrete tasks to keep her mind from wandering. She washed 2 cups, arranged her flowers, and mended a sleeve, all with movements that were exact and almost harsh. But every few minutes, her eyes went back to the blue ribbon on the table. Before noon, Mrs. Higgins returned. "I've brought no bread today," she said from the doorway. "I've come to tell you that I saw Julian early at the notary's office. He wasn't with the clerk this time. He was with Mr. Sterling himself." The baker stepped inside, her voice dropping. "Listen to me, Clara. If that man returns today, do not receive him alone." "And who am I supposed to call?" Clara asked with a tired, dry laugh. "The mayor? The priest who told me to accept my lot? The neighbors who prefer to cross themselves before they say hello? Mrs.?" Higgins didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked to the blue ribbon bouquet on the table, then back to Clara. "Call the one who doesn't look at you as if you are already defeated," she said. The words hung in the air long after the baker had left. The day progressed with a growing sense of dread. Clara didn't open her stall in the market. She stayed inside, waiting for Julian's footsteps, as one waits for a storm that is guaranteed to break. In the late afternoon, when the light began to turn a sickly yellow, she heard the sound of wagon wheels on the creek road. This time, there were 3 knocks. Julian was not alone. Clara took a deep breath, adjusted her shawl, and pulled back the bolt. Julian was there, of course, with the thin clerk by his side. But behind them, as if to dress their greed in the clothes of authority, came Mr. Sterling, the village notary, a small man with a sparse beard and shifting eyes that avoided looking at anything that might cost him a useful friendship. "Good evening," Julian said with a courtesy so cold it felt like iron. "I see you are disposed to receive us today." Clara gripped the doorframe. When 3 men come to the house of a woman alone, it isn't exactly a visit. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thorne, we are only here to formalize a simple procedure." "A procedure that requires 3 men and no clear explanation?" Clara countered. Julian exhaled through his nose in exasperation. "Clara, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." "Explain it right here," she demanded. Julian exchanged a quick glance with the notary before speaking. "The house and the plot were put up as collateral by Arthur nearly 2 years ago. There are overdue payments. If you don't sign the temporary administration agreement, the property will go to public auction before the winter solstice." Clara felt a hollow, freezing void open beneath her feet. "Arthur never spoke to me about that." "Because he didn't want to worry you," Julian said smoothly. "Or because it doesn't exist the way you are telling it," Clara retorted. Julian's jaw tightened. "Are you insinuating that I am lying?" "I am insinuating that I do not trust you." The silence on the threshold became thick and suffocating. A gust of wind kicked up some dry leaves and dragged them against the porch. Mr. Sterling seemed uncomfortable, but not enough to leave. "If you have doubts," he murmured, "you can sign today, and we can review the details with calm later." Clara looked at him with disbelief. Sign first and understand later? What a convenient piece of advice. It was at that moment that a 4th voice, grave and calm, reached them from the path. "It is not." The 3 men turned at once. Silas Vance was advancing from the entrance of the property with the steady step of a man who didn't need to hurry to make himself noticed. He wore a dark coat, and his hands were empty. But there was something in his presence that altered the very air. He wasn't a loud threat. He was an authority born of a quiet, unbending strength. Julian looked at him with open hostility. "This does not concern you." Silas didn't look at him at first. He looked at Clara. "I saw the wagon from the road and thought perhaps you didn't want to receive 3 visitors alone." The sentence, spoken without drama, gave Clara an unexpected surge of power. She straightened her back. "I didn't." "Now you aren't," Silas said, finally turning his gaze toward the others. Julian let out a dry, mocking laugh. "And what role do you play here? Lawyer? Relative? Executor? Witness," Silas replied, the word falling with a strange weight. "Mister." Sterling was the first to react, his small eyes darting between the 2 men. "There is no need for a scandal," he muttered. "Then don't provoke one," Silas said. "If those papers are legitimate, they can be explained in front of anyone." Julian took a step toward him. "I will not allow a stranger to meddle in my family's affairs." Silas didn't even blink. Family shouldn't be used as a cloak for theft. The blow was sharp, not because of the volume, but because of the naked truth of it. Clara saw the color drain from Julian's face. Mr. Sterling opened his mouth, but said nothing. "Watch your words," Julian hissed. "I am watching them quite well." There was a tense silence. Silas reached out a hand toward Clara. "May I see the document?" She hesitated for only a second before handing it over. Seeing those pages in the hands of someone else, in steady hands, made her breathe a little easier. Silas read the parchment with a focused speed, flipping from one page to the next. He stopped at the clause that had alarmed her earlier, then looked up. "This doesn't say temporary administration. It says the cession of use and usufruct for an indefinite period." Mr. Sterling swallowed hard. "It is a standard formula. It is a standard trap," Silas corrected. Julian no longer tried to feign politeness. "Give me back that paper!" "I will give it back to her," Silas said, and he did. He placed the documents back into Clara's hands, the gesture reminding everyone who the owner of that threshold really was. "Do not sign anything today," he added, looking only at her. "Not until an honest clerk from outside this valley has reviewed it." Julian stepped forward, his body rigid. "You are putting ideas where they aren't wanted." Silas turned his head slightly. "Ideas aren't necessary to recognize an ambush." The situation was on the verge of breaking. Clara felt it in Julian's trembling hands and the way his fingers curled into fists. But she also saw something else. He didn't quite dare to strike, because it was one thing to pressure a widow alone, and quite another to do it in front of a man who refused to look away. Mr. Sterling was the first to retreat. "It would be better to postpone this," he whispered. Julian glared at him. "No." But the notary had already smelled the danger of being too exposed. "I said it would be better to postpone it." The clerk took a step back as well. The balance of the abuse was beginning to unravel. Julian realized that, for today, he had lost his ground. He looked at Clara with a cold, contained hatred. "Very well. Do it the hard way. But remember this. Winters are long, and dignity doesn't heat a hollow house." Clara held his gaze with a tremor she didn't let reach her voice. "Greed doesn't make it a home either." Julian smiled without joy, took the portfolio from the clerk, and turned away. The notary and the other man followed him with a poorly disguised haste. The wagon took little time to disappear, but the air remained vibrating long after they were gone. Clara closed the door with weak hands, only then noticing how much she was shaking. She leaned against the table, unsure if she was going to cry, fall, or simply stay still until nightfall. Silas didn't speak immediately. He kept a respectful distance, as if he knew that after such a humiliation, even help can feel heavy if it invades too much. "Thank you," Clara said at last, almost in a whisper. He shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me yet. That man hasn't finished." "I know, and neither have you." She looked up. There was a weary exhaustion in Silas's eyes, but also a quiet conviction that was rare in a world used to men who only protected what they owned. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't owe me anything." Silas remained silent for a few seconds, then looked at the blue ribbon bouquet on the table. "Because I know what a house smells like when fear lives inside," he said. "And because once I arrived too late to defend something that mattered." Clara felt those words open a dark door behind him. A history, a wound, but she didn't ask. There are pains that are recognized before they deserve to be touched. Outside, a soft drizzle began to fall, a thin rain that darkened the earth by the creek. "You shouldn't go back alone in this weather," she murmured. Silas allowed himself a shadow of tired irony. "I've gone back alone through worse paths." Clara wanted to say something more, to offer tea, to retain that presence for just a moment longer, but she didn't know how to do it without breaking the delicacy of what had occurred. "Tomorrow I am going to the neighboring town," he said. "There is an honest clerk near the railway station. If you like, I can take a copy of those papers to him." Clara looked at him with surprise. "You would do that?" "Someone should be on your side before they push you over the edge." It was then that Clara understood that the true danger was no longer just Julian or the winter or the threatened plot. The true danger was beginning to trust this silent man who spoke little, saw too much, and had just become, without asking permission, the first refuge her life had known in months. The drizzle continued to fall for much of the afternoon, persistent and quiet, as if the sky wanted to soak every corner of the valley without making a sound. Clara accompanied Silas to the door, watching him as he descended the 3 wooden steps and stopped by the leaning fence post. The water was beginning to darken the shoulders of his coat. "I will pass by early tomorrow," he said without turning around completely. "If you decide you don't want to hand over the papers, I will understand." Clara pressed the documents against her chest. "I want to hand them over," he nodded once. "Then keep them where that man cannot find them." That simple, grave recommendation reminded her that the danger hadn't gone away. It had only stepped back a few paces. Clara waited until Silas disappeared into the light fog of the path before she closed the door. She stayed motionless in the middle of the cottage, listening to the dripping water and the accelerated beating of her own heart. She didn't delay. She lifted the loose floorboard under the bed where Arthur used to hide their meager savings and placed the documents there, wrapped in an old cloth. Even then, she didn't feel a true sense of peace. That night, she ate a meager soup, but her appetite was gone. Every time she sat down, she found herself standing up again. She checked the bolt, closed the back window, and lit the lamp only to blow it out a moment later. Finally, exhausted by a tension that wouldn't let her rest, she sat at the table and let her eyes fall on the blue ribbon. She took it in her hands, slowly. The salvia branch still gave off a faint medicinal scent. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. It had been so long since anyone had left something at her door without expecting an explanation or a future debt. That delicacy moved her more than she was willing to admit. She thought about his words, "I arrived too late to defend something that mattered." She didn't know what Silas had lost: a woman, a mother, a daughter, or simply a part of himself, but she understood the tone of someone speaking from an old guilt. For the first time since Arthur's death, she felt the impulse to know someone else's wound. At dawn, the sky was clear, but the mud on the path held the memory of the rain. Clara rose before the first light, braided her hair with hands that felt clumsier than usual, and prepared dark coffee. When the sun had not yet fully broken over the horizon, a double knock sounded at the door. It was Silas. His hat was damp with dew, and his horse was saddled behind the fence. Clara opened the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The bluish light of the morning wrapped them in a strange, almost domestic intimacy that made her feel vulnerable in a new way. "I thought perhaps you had changed your mind," he said. "I thought perhaps you wouldn't come," she replied. "I said I would." That serene accuracy made her smile, almost against her will. It was a small, tired smile. But Silas saw it, and something in his dark eyes softened with a contained discretion. Clara retrieved the papers. He was still standing at the threshold, never taking a step too far into her space. She handed them over, wrapped in the cloth. "I don't know what that clerk will say," she murmured. "He will tell the truth, or he will stop working for me," Silas replied. Clara blinked in surprise. "He works for you?" "Sometimes he reviews contracts for the conservatory. He doesn't like owing favors, which makes him almost honest." "That sounds expensive," she noted. Silas allowed himself a small exhale that was almost a laugh. "It is. That is why he is reliable." That brief moment of shared humor felt like a luxury Clara hadn't enjoyed in years. She wanted to tell him to be careful, that the mud could be treacherous, but the truth was that she simply needed him to come back. "Be safe," she said at last. He looked at her directly. "You as well." When he left, the morning became too silent. Clara tried to fill the hours with chores. She washed clothes in a zinc tub, shook out the blankets, and trimmed the dried stalks of her flowers, but time seemed to thicken. Every sound on the road made her turn her head. Around noon, Mrs. Higgins appeared with a warm loaf of bread and a piece of news. "Julian is furious," the baker said, stepping inside. "He went to the tavern this morning and told everyone that he had been humiliated by an outcast. You know how some men are with wounded pride? They would rather lose money than lose face." Clara felt a shiver. "Did he say anything else?" Mrs. Higgins hesitated. "He said he wouldn't let anyone take what belongs to him." "Nothing belongs to him," Clara snapped. "I know that, and you know that, but men like Julian only obey their own greed." The afternoon began to lean toward evening, and with it the dread grew. Silas had not yet returned. The sun was already gilding the damp trunks of the trees when Clara finally heard the sound of hooves in the mud. She ran to the porch before she could think. Silas was dismounting, his face looking more severe than it had in the morning. "They aren't good papers," he said as he climbed the steps. He handed her the portfolio and entered only when she moved aside. Inside the cottage, he spread the sheets on the table. "The signature of your husband has been forged on 2 of the pages. The clerk compared it with an old receipt I had from the mill. They don't match. Furthermore, the actual debt was much smaller than Julian claimed." Clara leaned against the table for support. "So he tried to take my house with false papers?" "Yes," Silas replied. "There was no attempt to sugarcoat it." "Can it be proven?" Clara asked. "The clerk has already drafted a certification. He also spoke of taking it to the district judge if necessary." Clara looked up. "That will only make Julian angrier." "He was already angry," Silas noted. There was a tense silence. Outside, a gust of wind moved the branches of the willow by the creek. Inside, the unlit lamp reflected a bit of golden light on the table. "I don't want you to get any deeper into this," Clara said suddenly. Silas watched her without surprise. "Because it is dangerous. Because you have enough of your own troubles. Because the village will talk even worse of us." He placed both hands on the edge of the table. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without a title or distance. "That man already made his decision before I intervened. He isn't furious because I meddled. He is furious because you stopped bowing your head." She felt those words strike the center of something painful. "I don't know if I had courage or if I was just tired. Sometimes they are the same thing," he said. Clara looked down at the papers. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. "What am I supposed to do now?" Silas opened his bag and pulled out a cleaner sheet with a recent seal. "Tomorrow you will go with me to see the assistant judge at the old station. The clerk has already sent a note. If you declare that Julian tried to make you sign under false pretenses, these documents will be annulled immediately." "Go with you?" Clara asked, lifting her head slowly. "If I appear with you at the station, the whole valley will know before sunset." "The valley already talks," he said. Not like this. He looked at her for a few seconds. Then decide what weighs more, the rumor or the house. The sober hardness of that sentence silenced her. He was right. And yet it wasn't just the rumor that unsettled her. It was the way the mere idea of going with him stirred something more intimate, something more disordered, and difficult to name. Silas seemed to sense it, because his voice softened slightly as he added, "If you prefer, I can ask Mrs. Higgins to accompany us." Clara took a deep breath. "No, if I go, I will go without hiding behind another woman." He nodded, and in that gesture, there was a kind of proud, silent respect. The night fell over the house, without either of them noticing. Silas lit the lamp with a natural ease, as if he were accustomed to moving in silence within other people's spaces without disturbing them. The warm light drew the mix of hardness and exhaustion on his face that Clara was beginning to recognize. "You shouldn't leave now," she said. "The road is heavy, and you haven't eaten since morning." He was going to refuse, so she spoke quickly. "It isn't charity. There is soup and bread, and it would be indecent to let you leave like this." Silas accepted the offer, and they ate face to face with the table illuminated by the lamp. It was a simple scene, but it moved Clara deeply. The quiet normality of sharing bread with someone who didn't humiliate her was a massive luxury. For a while, they spoke only of what was necessary: the road to the station, the train schedule, the assistant judge. But slowly, the conversation began to loosen. "Why flowers?" Clara asked suddenly. Silas looked up from his bowl. "What?" "The conservatory. The plants. That kind of care doesn't seem like something a man the town fears so much would choose by chance." Silas was silent for a moment. Clara thought she had overstepped, but finally he answered, "My mother used to grow them. Not here, further north. Before I ever came to this valley." Clara waited. "She used to say a plant doesn't bloom better because you yell at it," he continued. "It blooms if it finds a place to take hold." Clara felt a slight shiver. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, and she died. He looked at her, his eyes steady. He didn't say more, but Clara understood that the loss was still alive, that the conservatory was perhaps not just a job, but a memory, a way of not letting certain hands disappear entirely. "I am sorry," she whispered. He accepted the sentiment with a slight nod. The silence returned, but it was no longer uncomfortable. When they finished dinner, Silas stood up. "I must go." "Tomorrow, then," Clara said. She accompanied him to the door. Outside, the night was clear and cold. Silas turned to her before descending the steps. "Lock your door well, and if that man returns before dawn, do not open it. I won't." He hesitated for a second, as if there were something else he wanted to say, but in the end he only added, "You are not alone, Clara." Those 4 words pierced her chest with a sudden tenderness. She had to grip the doorframe to keep from showing it. He left immediately, and as she leaned her back against the door, she repeated the phrase to herself in the dark. She didn't know yet that the following day would test not only her house, but that newly born trust. The dawn arrived with a harder frost than the days before. Clara rose before the first light, dressed in silence, and wrapped herself in her thickest shawl. When she opened the door, the sky was just beginning to pale. Silas was already there by the fence with the horse saddled and a blanket folded over his arm. He didn't have the severe expression of the previous days, but something more contained. "It is colder than I expected," he said. She nodded. "Me too." He handed her the blanket. "Put this over your legs when you climb up. The path is still damp." The trip to the old station passed through mud and the vapors of cold earth. Clara sat sideways in the small wagon Silas had brought so she wouldn't have to ride a horse, the blanket over her knees and her hands clasped together. He drove without speaking much, attentive to the deep ruts and the rocks hidden beneath the slush. At times, when the wagon tilted too much, he would lift a hand without looking at her, just in case she needed to steady herself. Clara never actually took his hand, but seeing it there, available, gave her a strange calm. The old station was a low building of weathered brick, a narrow platform, and an office that always smelled of ink, coal, and damp papers. The assistant judge, Mr. Vance, received them with a dry formality but no hostility. On his desk were the notes from the clerk and the certification comparing the signatures. Clara spoke at first with a contained voice, then with a firmness she hadn't known she possessed. The judge listened without interrupting, except to ask for dates and names. When she finished, he took the certification and tapped the desk with his knuckles. "This is enough to suspend any attempt at a session," he said. "And if your brother-in-law insists, he will move from greed to a criminal offense." Clara felt the air return to her lungs. "So he cannot take the house?" "Not by this route," the judge replied. "And if he shows up again with those documents, send for the constable." Silas, who had remained silent, asked, "Should we notify him today?" Mr. Vance looked up. "Yes, and it would be best to do it in front of witnesses. Men like that only understand what humiliates them." That last sentence proved more prophetic than Clara would have liked. They returned to the valley late in the afternoon. Clara held the signed resolution from the judge as if she were carrying proof that the world was still capable of tilting toward the right side. It wasn't happiness she felt yet, but relief. But as they reached the creek path, Silas tightened the reins. "Wait here." Clara sat up straight. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately, looking ahead with a tensed body. Then she saw it too. A thin column of dark smoke was rising from behind the willows, exactly where her land was. Her heart stopped. "Silas," she whispered. He urged the horse forward. The wagon moved faster than was prudent, jumping over the ruts, and when they turned the last corner of the path, Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The rear of the cottage was burning. It wasn't an uncontrolled blaze yet, but it was enough to devour the woodpile and crawl up the exterior wall. Thick smoke was coming from the small back window. Two neighbors were shouting from the fence. Mrs. Higgins was running with a bucket. A boy from the mill was going back and forth from the creek with pails of water. Everything was noise, smoke, and chaos, and in the middle of it, Clara could only see one thing: her house, her last refuge, under attack. She jumped from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "Clara, no!" Mrs. Higgins screamed. "Don't go inside!" But she was already running toward the door, blinded by terror. Silas caught her in two strides and grabbed her by the shoulders. "Listen to me! My things! The papers! The photo of Arthur! The papers are with you!" he shouted. That stopped her for a second. It was true. She was clutching them against her chest. But the rest, everything she owned, was inside. "Let me go," she gasped, struggling against him. "If you go in now, you won't come out," Silas said firmly. A beam creaked inside the house. The smoke turned blacker. Silas snatched a blanket from a nearby line, soaked it in a bucket, and began to beat the flames rising up the wall. His ability to act in the middle of chaos seemed to come from some ancient place. He gave brief orders. "Bring more water. Clear the dry wood. Make space." In a few minutes, the fire stopped growing. The woodpile was destroyed. But the cottage, by some miracle and immense effort, did not fall. When the smoke finally began to dissipate, Clara was still standing motionless by the fence, trembling so hard that Mrs. Higgins had to put an arm around her. "Breathe, dear," she said. "Just breathe." Clara obeyed as best she could, though the air scraped her throat. She had soot on her skirt, dried tears on her face, and her heart was hammering with a violence that made her dizzy. She looked around as if seeing the world from a distance. The charred wall, the neighbors, and there, by the willow tree, Julian. He was being held by the miller and the boy from the mill. He wasn't helping, he was just watching. The revelation struck her like a freezing blade. It was him, she whispered. Then, with a louder voice broken by rage, it was him. Silas followed her gaze, his eyes hardening in a way Clara had never seen. It wasn't a wild fury. It was something worse, a cold decision. Julian realized too late that he had been seen. He tried to step back, but the smell of kerosene in the air and the extinguished torch by the post condemned him more than any speech could. The assistant judge arrived an hour later with the constable, and by nightfall, Julian was being taken away in a custody wagon. The valley, forced to look at his greed and cruelty head-on, stopped speaking his name with respect. That night, the cottage was wounded but still standing. Mrs. Higgins insisted on staying, and other neighbors brought blankets and food. But when the noise faded, it was Silas who remained until the very end. Clearing the remains of the woodpile and securing the back door, Clara watched him from the porch, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. When he finally climbed the steps, he had soot on his hands and a small burn on his wrist. "You are hurt," she said. "It is nothing. Let me see." He was going to refuse, but something in her voice made him extend his arm. She led him to the table, found clean water and a rosemary ointment. As she cleaned the burn, she felt the weight of the silence between them. "You could have left," she murmured. "No one would have blamed you. I wasn't going to leave you here alone with this. You always say the same thing, because it is true." Clara tightened the bandage slightly. Silas didn't complain. "I almost lost it," she whispered. "No," he said, and the word was small but carried a warmth so absolute that Clara felt something that had been hardened inside her finally begin to give way. The tears came then, tears of exhaustion, of relief, of having resisted for too long, without a place to rest her head. She tried to turn away in shame, but Silas offered no empty phrases. He simply stepped closer. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara stopped holding herself up alone. She leaned her forehead against his chest and cried. Silas wrapped his arms around her slowly, as if he were holding something sacred and fragile. There was no haste. There was only refuge. In the months that followed, the cottage was rebuilt. The back wall was stronger than before, and the town learned to lower its voice when mentioning Clara Thorne and Silas Vance. Dignity, she realized, did not depend on the town's forgiveness, but on her own strength. One morning in spring, when the first flowers were blooming in the back of the conservatory, Silas led her there. They were tall, firm, and vibrant. "My mother would have wanted you to see these," he said. Clara understood then that he was inviting her not just into his home, but into his history. There was no greater gift. As the years passed, those who walked by the old conservatory could see a simple and extraordinary sight. A woman who once almost lost everything, watering plants alongside a man who had been feared before he was known. Sometimes they worked in silence. Sometimes they smiled, and in that quiet, domestic scene lived a true victory. Looking back on a life that has weathered both the biting frost of neglect and the scorching heat of betrayal, one realizes that the true measure of a home is not found in the strength of its timber or the height of its walls, but in the quality of the presence that remains when the world grows cold. For those of us who have lived long enough to see the seasons turn many times, there is a quiet understanding that the most profound acts of human kindness are often the ones that require no audience and expect no reward. We spend our youth chasing grand promises and loud declarations, yet as the years settle into our bones, we find that the only thing that truly sustains us is the steady, unyielding respect of someone who sees our worth even when we have forgotten it ourselves. Dignity is not something that can be stolen by a forged signature or a cruel word. It is an internal flame that, once recognized by another, can turn even the most desolate winter into a season of growth. To find a hand that reaches out without a hidden agenda is the greatest wealth one can accumulate. We must remember that even the most withered flowers have a history of beauty, and that a heart that has been broken is often the one most capable of sheltering another. In the end, the stories we leave behind are not written in the dust of the things we possessed, but in the quiet moments of solidarity that proved we were never truly alone.